Do you remember one of the best free-to-play World War II games ever made? No, I'm not talking about Enlisted, you silly goose. Would anybody call a Gaijin game one of the best games ever? Okay, there are a few people, but we know where they get their money from. Daddy's money, that was the joke. Heroes and Generals was the free-to-play World War II game before Enlisted ever came about. It lived a life, a long, prosperous life, like your nan who fought in 18 wars and ate cookies for breakfast. She said she smoked 14 packs a day and that was the secret to her long life, but really, most people just lived to 84 anyway. Heroes and Generals was around for such a long time, and because of it, it went through so many stages, from its very early access to later huge updates, bringing in bigger maps like, well, the Rommel update, completely changing its gameplay, making people very angry, then bringing people back later on. Then eventually, like any multiplayer-only game, the latter parts in its life were just a few stragglers. The hardcore players that were here since the beginning, that didn't want to lose their progression, and would now hate playing the game. They were the equivalent of sticking with your toxic ex-partner just because you've already sunk 4 years into this relationship, but actually, you can tell she no longer loves you anymore, and you actually don't really love her anymore because she's a terrible human being. I was still talking about Heroes and Generals. But where did it start? How did it go through this progression? And how did it finish in its very sorry end? And what happened to that sequel? You remember Heroes and Generals? Anyway, we'll get to Heroes and Generals too. This is pretty much the beginning, the middle, the end, the future, and the inevitable demise of the community around Heroes and Generals. In 2011, Retromoto, the developers, released their first teaser trailer for an alpha version of a new free-to-play World War II game. H&G, or Heroes and Generals to us noobs. I actually played so many hours of this back in the day, but I joined later on in its full release of 2016. This was the initial early access alpha that only a few hardcore fellas got into. You know those people that set up German-only servers on Hell Let Loose that try and fantasize what would have happened if the Wehrmacht actually didn't get stomped? Yeah, these were the kind of people that started this very, very early version of Heroes and Generals. It was actually based on their Retox engine. This was their own browser-based 3D game engine. However, browser-based games never had a good reputation, and this was actually Heroes and Generals' reputation in 2012. It was not on Steam at this point in time. Because of it, a browser-based World War II game, oh my god, it was always going to look absolute trash. I mean, even on its release, Heroes and Generals had outdated graphics for the time, but that was not really its selling point. Its selling point was the first-person shooter mixed with this large-scale warfare, kind of like Battlefield, but also some vague RTS mechanics, having continuous and persistent wars, with the Germans and the US having certain parts of the map that they had to take over, and of course progressing while taking territory. People and commanders could decide where attacks happened and where battles would begin, and this is where you go down into your first-person Battlefield style of gameplay, with jeeps, tanks, planes, and of course your general infantry. Whether you're fighting as assault gunners with MP40s and Thompsons, snipers with your Springfields, your Kar 98Ks, or rocket launchers with your Panzer Shreks that inevitably didn't really work that well, but made you feel really cool when you snuck up behind some Sherman. 2014 was the big year for Heroes and Generals, though. This is when it released on Steam into early access. Do you remember that time where every other YouTuber was playing it? Frankie on PC when he was a thing? Also, he keeps making some comeback and then going off to do some other stuff. I thought he quit being a lawyer. Mate, I would love some videos around about now. I have nothing else to do with my life. The Yogscast were such big proponents for the Heroes and Generals launch, playing countless videos and even doing live action stuff where they must have been paid Mr. Beast style of money to be able to get a Sherman to, well, pretend to shoot and potentially almost kill themselves. Yet this was all down to Heroes and Generals and their sponsorships. They put a lot of money behind the game, and it's not like they didn't have that much backing. In fact, in 2012 and 2013, they were losing millions of dollars. This just being a free-to-play browser-based game with a fairly small community, they needed to do something big, which is why they probably put a few more $1 million towards the next year in 2014 to bring it onto Steam. This was the hope to bring in a wider audience. And did it work? Well, yeah, it actually kind of did. They needed to find out a way to make money, and fast. You see, the gaming industry is a lucrative thing if you can dip your fingers into the gold pools of nerds, but free-to-play? Well, that's not going to make much. Okay, they added in a ton of microtransactions. In fact, it was completely changing the RTS portion of the game, adding in a new update which basically let you pay to win. Okay, granted, it didn't affect the actual battles themselves, and this was the main portion that I really got stuck into. Most people just played this as a free-to-play World War II battlefield, jumping in with your mates, playing in squads, driving in jeeps, and, you know, when you held that map right up to your face, and it looked like you couldn't see anything. Yeah, absolute peak comedy in 2014. But this update affected the RTS portion so much, it kind of stopped people from playing that bit. Heroes and Generals thus became a first-person shooter. Pretty much it. Okay, the hardcore people still focused on that RTS stuff, but if I'm going to be honest, I think most people watching this didn't realize it even existed. Essentially, people playing the RTS portion of the game would have certain resources in order to bolster up their armies, you know, actually deciding where they make these battles happen and which territory they can capture. It was put in that you could buy unlimited resources essentially to let people invade wherever they wanted to. Given the choice, people bought a lot. In fact, they went from losing money to making, I think, over 25 million crowns in the year. By the way, crowns is the currency they use in Denmark. Oh, it's crowns. No, not the Mr. Beast one. No. This wasn't the only baffling decision made by the developers for Heroes and Generals, by the way. The Russians were soon added into the game, and they were added as a third faction. Cool, makes sense. I mean, that's what you do. Separate faction. So, wait, there's no alliances. Hold on. This means you can have the US fighting the Russians. Okay, sure. We're going this direction now. The game was actually fairly successful for quite some time. On its early access launch in July of 2014, it hit a peak of 11,698 players. Why so specific, you might ask? That's because I'm currently on SteamDB as I'm recording this bit, and it's telling me the exact numbers. Anyway, it actually started to go up and up and up, with further updates coming out. In 2015, we were up to 13,500 concurrent players before its final release in September of 2016. It actually got a full game release and peaked at 21,000 players. Absolute insanity. They had done it. Heroes and Generals had managed to make a free-to-play World War II shooter, which was not only profitable, but also players really wanted to play. Hold on. Why are we heading downhill so fast? Why are we going downhill so... Guys! After the full release, more updates were coming out. In fact, there were complete overhauls to some of the game mechanics. One of the more important ones being a complete change to gunplay. This meant there was huge multipliers to headshots. Any gun would pretty much demolish your skull from 50 meters. Imagine Sniper Elite 5, but now it was in a huge 100-player battle that was free to play and anybody could get into it. You know, it's always a bad idea when anybody can come into your games because you end up getting some of the most interesting enemies to ever play with. Guns became infinitely more inaccurate, or at least harder to use, and this started to turn players off. Really, where the downfall started was after its release. Because of this huge spike, it brought in a mass amount of new players. On the surface, this was a good thing, right? More people were getting to experience it. But it wasn't just settling back to its regular 9,000-10,000 concurrent players after that. It was a very slow decline. In the coming years, we saw more and more updates, and more community outrage at said updates. Whether they were breaking the games like three-way battles, completely changing the way mechanics were so veteran or older players did not get the same feeling they once did from Heroes and Generals. There was news of investments coming into the development team, but nobody seeing any direct correlation or effects of that coming into Heroes and Generals, and that started to put its original players off. The trust had been lost, but that is the start of the end. When the development team lose the trust of its community, they don't communicate properly, and unfortunately for a free-to-play game, that is all they have. A strong community that will continue to buy in-game items, and of course all the microtransactions they continue to pump into it. And they really did. From 2016 onwards, microtransactions were ramped up to the next level, completely being thrust in every player's faces, whether it was daily rewards or new skins. This game was going rampant, and people were really starting to push back now. As we moved into 2018, Ritomoto, the developers, decided that things were going downhill. Money was stopping coming in because the player base was dwindling. The updates that they had brought out were breaking the game, if anything, and this meant that when it actually got to Steam's full release, they had to just push it out with nothing else new. From that point onwards, there was just small additions to gunplay mechanics and of course a few sound updates, but all in all, nobody was happy with the state of the title. At the end of 2018, it was announced that they'd be sizably reducing their team after not making enough money. Who could have seen that one coming, lads? Who could have seen that? Probably everybody. 18 million crap. You lost 18 million crowns to Z. Every bit of criticism from its 2016 release to the end of 2021 and 2022, Heroes and Generals and Rito specifically were pushing back. They basically throttled all of their content creators to the point that nobody wanted to play it anymore. The player base were having to pay too much money in order to actually get a decent experience because, well, everybody else was, so they didn't want to play it anymore. Not only that, but huge amounts of money was being spent on a development team that just weren't doing the job that they were supposed to. Is that on them? Who knows? But not releasing the correct updates at the correct time mostly indicates towards it being poor management. The result is exactly the same. A lackluster title that seems to have outlived. I think Heroes and Generals lasted for a long time, but perhaps a little bit too long. It got to the point where it overstayed its welcome, and by this point, people were ready for something else. Enlisted released a few years ago, being the World War II free-to-play game that now everybody kind of migrated to. Is it perfect? No. Does it have a great company behind it? But is it better than Heroes and Generals? By a million miles. It probably won't last nearly as long because of the nearly a decade run that H&G had, but Heroes and Generals wanted to come back with something bigger. They were not over and they were not done, and this is when Heroes and Generals 2 was announced. About this time last year, I was actually talking about the Kickstarter that came up. They wanted to raise $2 million for a new game. A new World War II shooter that was now an Unreal Engine, and my god, some of these gameplay things looked alright. Hold on. Why are there so many bugs within their actual teasers? Why do these textures just look weird? And also, let's remind ourselves, this was the development company that has completely burned all bridges with its community. You see, Heroes and Generals didn't die because the game was terrible. They died because the developers did not know what they were doing, they didn't communicate sufficiently enough with their community, and they basically insulted them half the time. Then coming out a few years later, asking the community to fund their next game, not doing it themselves with all the money that they supposedly earned. Once again, they didn't earn a lot of money because they ended up spending way too much money on the development cycle, asking the community that they'd abused for a long time to do it for them. It was never going to end well, and very soon the Heroes and Generals Kickstarter campaign, whilst racking up a little bit of money, failed. In fact, they came out with a statement blaming... Actually, I think me. I made a video... I think they blamed me. I don't mean me specifically, but YouTubers. I think there was so much good that came from this game. It initially came out as a free-to-play World War II title that everybody kind of wanted. I had so much fun back in the day playing Heroes and Generals. In fact, it's some of my best experiences of gaming. Jumping on with 4 or 5 of my mates, getting absolutely demolished by the enemy team because actually we were kind of pathetic at the game, but still having fun nonetheless. Being able to hop on those really rickety bikes and cycling around wheat fields until we inevitably get sniped off. What more could you really want? Running around in tanks, not quite knowing the controls, getting bombed by planes, and then pretending that we're the Yogscast as we cascade down bridges whilst getting rocket launched in the flanks. There was a lot of fun to be had in Heroes and Generals, at least at the start, but I think delving too deep into its community, the poor updates, the complete microtransaction overhaul towards the latter end of its life, and the sheer desperation from its developers, then the pushback from the people that were supposed to be bringing the content back together, insulting them to the point where it pushed people so far away that they never came back. For a free-to-play game, they managed to make people pay a lot for it, and I think people are sick of that. People are sick of paying a lot of money for a game that the developers don't care as much about as they do, and that was shown when they shut down the title just to announce a sequel. You see, I don't think Heroes and Generals itself would have been shut down and the servers would have gone if they weren't planning on announcing Heroes and Generals 2. I think they did it just because it would give people more of an incentive to donate to their Kickstarter. You no longer have the game that you are here for. What if you want something different? Well, you're now going to have to give us money so we actually make it for you. Almost giving people no option if they wanted this experience. But it didn't work, thankfully. I think the community saw what was going on, and in fact, they didn't forget. They didn't forget the terrible updates, the game-breaking bugs, the balancing issues, the guns that no longer worked properly. They didn't forget the RTS mechanics that were completely ruined by microtransactions, and they did not forget the developers that did not communicate with them. So Heroes and Generals 2 never came to be, and in fact, I don't think it will ever come out. They did say that there's a potential of them doing it under their own steam, but who really knows at this point? I think Enlisted kind of has filled that hole that H&G left, and whilst I don't have the same memories, probably just down to nostalgia, not necessarily the quality of the game, I think it is still a decent-ish replacement. Once again, though, be skeptical. It's gauging after all. They make okay games, but it's like your grandma that pays you to be nice to them.